Hey guys, sorry there was a for the delay. For the interruption. I had to tend to my kids. But I was saying, if we didn't have the capacity to uptake oxygen, we just simply wouldn't survive. So I just wanted to finish up with that explanation. So the air that we breathe in travels down or inside our body through the nasal and oral cavities, and then you can see that it goes down the pharynx, and then the larynx, and then eventually into the trachea. Okay, the trachea we can feel right behind, right in our neck, right in front of our, we can feel that the ridge portion of our throat right here. That's the trachea. And behind the trachea is the esophagus. That's the pipe there, or the tube that food passes down whenever we eat food. The trachea then is broken up into the bronchi. So you have one bronchus here, one bronchus here, and then eventually into the bronchioles, which are the smaller branches. So our entire lung is pretty much bronchioles, and then eventually the endpoints of the bronchioles are these air sacs known as alveoli. One alveoli is known as an alveolus. That's singular for alveoli. All right. So at the alveolus, or this air sac, this is where we have that network of capillaries again. All right. So remember, coming from the lungs, we have blood coming from the pulmonary artery. The pulmonary artery is broken down into a smaller artery known as arterioles. So here are the pulmonary arterioles. You can see here, pulmonary arterioles. And then eventually the arterioles break down into a smaller network of vessels known as the capillaries. And each of these the capillaries surrounds each of the air sacs, or the alveoli. Okay, it's here where gas exchange occurs. I thought I had a picture of gas exchange. Maybe I don't. Okay. So what happens is that the oxygen we just breathed in from the air, the final destination is the alveolus, and the oxygen is then transported into the capillaries, where you can see the red portions of the capillaries and the venule are oxygen rich. The blue portions are oxygen deprived. So the blue portion are carrying carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is then transported into the alveolus. So whenever we breathe out, we're breathing out carbon dioxide. Okay, so this is where the gas exchange occurs. So again, we breathe in oxygen. That oxygen is transported into the capillaries, and eventually is sent back to the heart via the pulmonary venules and pulmonary veins. The pulmonary artery delivers oxygen-deprived blood to the lungs, and eventually is branched into the pulmonary arterioles, and those arterioles are broken down into a network of capillaries, where carbon dioxide is then released into the alveolus, and that's breathed out of the body. Okay, so that's where gas exchange occurs. So there's two areas of the body where gas exchange occurs, in the lungs and at the tissues. Okay. So now we have oxygen-rich blood in our blood vessels. All right, so it starts off with the pulmonary venules, and you can see here there's a couple of venules here, and each of the venules they come together and they merge to form the pulmonary vein. Okay, so that's where we are with the pulmonary vein. The pulmonary vein then sends blood, oxygen-rich blood, back to the heart, but this time it dumps into the left atrium. All right, so remember the two chambers up top of the two atria. The right atrium receives blood from the entire body. That's systemic circulation. But the left atrium receives blood from the lungs. That's pulmonary circulation. Okay, so this blood now is oxygen rich. The two atria contract at the same time. This time, blood from the left atrium is pumped into the left ventricle, and then the two ventricles contract almost immediately after the two atria contracts. You get that boom, 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 two pump system. The blood from the left atrium is pumped into the left ventricle, and then the second contraction occurs, and then the left ventricle pumps blood out of the heart again, but this time it goes to systemic circulation, meaning it's delivered to the entire body. Okay, and it exits the body out of the aorta, which is the largest artery in the body. Okay, so the aorta sends blood out of the heart. It then goes into the upper body, the head and neck, and arms, and then it then travels down the descending aorta behind the heart, and eventually delivers blood to the entire lower body. So my son's joining me. He's learning a lot. He's learning about the heart and the cardiovascular system, right? All right. All right. Now he's gonna go play basketball. Okay. All right. So that's the way that the cardiovascular system works. Again, you have the descending aorta sending blood to out the entire body. Okay. So it's pretty simple. Okay. Now, in order to understand how cardiovascular disease works, let me explain how, first of all, heart disease occurs. So, the heart itself is a muscle. It needs to receive oxygen from the blood, and just because it houses blood doesn't mean it captures oxygen from the blood that it houses. It has to deliver blood to itself, and there's a network of vessels blood vessels known as the coronary arteries that deliver blood to the heart itself. Okay, so whenever the blood leaves the left ventricle, it leaves the aorta, and you can see the aorta is about the size of a quarter, the diameter of a quarter. And then there's a blood vessel here. This is the left coronary artery, and then you have the right coronary artery. Okay, so blood then is then delivered or shunted into the left coronary artery and the right coronary artery, and these are the blood vessels that deliver blood to the heart itself. Okay, so if anything happens to these arteries, and you can see how thin they are compared to the aorta, the coronary arteries are about the size of spaghetti. If you can imagine a strand of spaghetti, that's about how wide the opening is for a coronary artery. So if anything happens to these arteries, if there's any blockage, whether it's plaque buildup, a blood clot, or any other foreign object, it would block the oxygen that's supposed to be delivered to parts of the heart. And if you think about it, if any of these arteries that feed oxygen to the left ventricle, and remember the left ventricle is the part of the heart that pumps blood to the rest of the body, including the brain. If the brain doesn't receive oxygen, then you die. Almost instantaneously. We can only survive, a couple of minutes without oxygen being delivered to the brain, and even then we could survive. We could sustain some brain damage. So it's a very alarming situation. This is, think about a heart attack. This is what happens whenever somebody experiences a heart attack. Is there's a blockage in one of these arteries. Okay. So how does this blockage occur? Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, we talk about the parts of the cardiovascular system are the heart, the blood vessels, and the blood itself. Okay, so when we talk about cardiovascular disease, we're talking about anything that affects those three systems. Okay, so one of the things that happens inside the arteries is this process known as atherosclerosis. And all that is just simply plaque buildup inside the heart to the point where it causes either a decrease in blood flow or no blood flow at all, a complete blockage. Okay, so you can see from the picture that normally whenever we look at a cross section of an artery, you can see how clean it is. So you have the internal lining, which is known as the endothelium. Oh no, I'm sorry, it's the tunica interna, and then you have the middle layer. This is a muscle layer. This is known as the tunica media, and then you have the external layer, which is a tough fibrous layer. This is known as the tunica externa. Okay, now the tunica. So the tunica media, or the middle layer, is a muscle layer. It allows our blood vessels, especially only our arteries, to contract and to relax, and to contract and to relax. Okay, and there's a purpose behind that. Okay, so this internal layer, it's about a one cell thick. It's a very thin layer, very delicate layer. In fact, whenever the artery breaks down down to the capillaries, the capillaries are simply just a continuation of the tunica interna. All right, so the capillaries don't have the middle layer or the external layer. So the capillaries are very, very delicate. Okay, fortunately, you know, if we damage a capillary, there's so much in the network that it really doesn't affect blood flow. Okay, all right, so this is what a normal, healthy artery looks like. And I will tell you, unfortunately, our arteries, for the most part, don't look like this. You know, no matter how healthy you are or how unhealthy you are, you know, it's very seldom that a person doesn't have any damage to an artery. Okay, for the most part, all of us experience at least some type of damage to the arteries, and that's really it's a product of age. You know, the older we live, the more damage we experience. Now, we can slow down the process, we can minimize the process by engaging in healthy lifestyle habits, but the more, you know, you're engaged in unhealthy habits, and, you know, what are considered unhealthy habits? Well, you know, living a sedentary lifestyle, you're not exercising, you're eating a high fatty or high sugary diet, you're you know, a drug abuser, and drug abuse is a loose term. It could be, you could be a cocaine addict, or you can be, you know, an avid coffee drinker or soda drinker. You know, smoking is a terrible habit in terms of impacting your cardiovascular disease. I'm sorry, your cardiovascular system. And the reason why all of these lifestyle habits are not unable to, or the inability to manage stress, is another reason, or another way that we can damage the cardiovascular system. So the more that we engage in these negative lifestyle habits, the more likely we're putting damage on our cardiovascular system, especially our arteries. Okay, so what's happening is whenever we engage in any of those habits, whether it's stress, drug abuse, caffeine use, you know, having high blood pressure, all that puts a tremendous amount of pressure on the arteries, because the arteries, they constrict, relax, constrict, relax, constrict, relax, constrict, relax, and over time it just puts wear and tear. I mean, imagine a rubber band. Now, if you ever stretch a rubber band, that's putting stress on it, and then you relax it, you stretch it, you relax it, you stretch it. You do it enough times, it starts to crack, it starts to dry out, and that's what happens inside our arteries. It starts to crack. All right, so we have an initial tear in the arterial wall. You can see that that's what, you know, that's what's happening here. Now, this tear doesn't mean we have cardiovascular disease, but now that we have a tear, you know, we also at the same time, you know, we eat food, and the more fat that we consume, the more fat is in our blood. And you can see an example here and here and even in here. And let me see if I get some other pictures here. You can see some. These are just graphic representations of what looks like inside the blood. Okay, so whenever these fatty deposits, I'm going to call them fatty deposits, or fat droplets. You know, I mean, it could be cholesterol, it could be low density lipoproteins, it could be triglycerides. But for the sake of this class, let's just call it fat droplets. Okay, and if you imagine those fat droplets are sticky, so whenever they're passing through the blood vessel, through the artery, and they come across this tear in the artery, they can stick to it. Okay, and then another droplet comes and sticks to that. And then another droplet comes to stick to that, to where eventually you start to develop a plaque inside the artery, okay? And this plaque starts to decrease the surface where, or decrease the volume where blood can flow, okay? So now, even then, I mean, this is the beginning of cardiovascular disease. But what's happening and why it becomes so threatening is already you're decreasing the capacity to deliver blood to the artery. I mean, to the vessel, to the tissues. Okay. But then, also what's happening is that all these blood cells only have a restricted area into which, through which to move, and they come together. And if you imagine, like if you ever cut yourself, you clot, right? Well, that's what starts to happen. They start to come together, and those blood cells start to stick together and form a blood clot. Okay, so the plaque buildup coupled with the blood clot completely closes the artery, and any tissues located after or beyond that point of blockage is not receiving oxygen. Okay, this can happen in any artery in the body, any artery. If it happens in the arm, it causes pain in the arm. If it happens in the leg, it causes pain in the leg. You know, and even if it happens in a vessel in the carotid artery leading to the brain, if it doesn't cause a stroke, it could cause, you know, a heart attack. Headaches. But since the vessels inside the artery and inside the heart are so thin that, you know, if this happens inside the heart, it leads to a heart attack immediately. And if it happens on the left side of the heart and your left side in the left ventricle isn't allowed to pump blood out of the heart, then you can't survive. That's a massive heart attack. You can't survive that. Okay. Now, there's ways to reverse this process. Number one, if you reverse all your habits and start engaging in healthier habits, you start exercising, you start eating better, start eating the right types of foods, the plaque buildup, you know, could actually reverse, and you could actually decrease the amount of plaque that's inside the arteries. We'll talk about that later on this summer. But then, you know, there are some surgical or medical interventions. The first one is like a stent where they insert a microscopic deflated balloon inside, and it would probably be in a situation like this. They would insert the microscopic deflated balloon inside the artery to the location where the blockage has occurred, and then they would blow up the balloon and hopefully push all the plaque towards the wall of the artery, thus opening up the artery. The second procedure is known as a bypass, where they can get a piece of a vein from the leg, and they'll attach that piece to, you know, the aorta up around right here. And let's say this blockage occurs right here where it says anterior interventricular branch of the LCA. I know it's a lot, but if this was the blockage, then they can attach the vein to the aorta here, and then they attach the second part beyond that blockage point. So now blood can bypass that blockage area. Okay, so if they do it twice, it's a double bypass, triple bypass, quadruple bypass, you know, so on and so forth. Okay, so there's different ways they can treat it. But really the best thing to do is to start engaging in healthier lifestyle habits. One of them is regular exercise, and then another thing is improving your diet. And if you're engaged in any drug use, whether it's caffeine or cocaine or nicotine or smoking, to try to, you know, either minimize or to just avoid it altogether. Okay. And then the last thing is trying to manage your stress, to try to either avoid stressful situations or learn how to cope with stressful situations. Okay. The other thing that I haven't really talked about yet was the high sugary diets. The mechanism for arterial damage with high sugary diets is a little different in that the high sugar content actually erodes the internal layer of the artery, thus causing damage to the arterial wall. So, the sugar doesn't cause the blockage; it causes the tear. But then any part that's torn is a place where plaque can start to formulate. Okay, so different reasons, and we'll talk about all of them as we go through the course. Okay. So here's some picture. You can see here that this is a person's high fatty diet. It has a lot of fat in their blood after it's spun out in centrifugation. You can see here's another picture of a blood clot starting to form with all the red blood cells trying to pass through a restricted area. This picture here shows what it's like to have the healthy artery, and then you have the accumulation of plaque buildup to where now you have a restricted area for blood to flow. Some more pictures. Okay, another form of cardiovascular disease is hypertension. Now, hypertension is defined as chronic high blood pressure. So what is high blood pressure? Well, in order to understand high blood pressure, you got to understand what normal blood pressure is. and you can see the numbers for normal blood pressure are anything less than 120 over 80 millimeters of mercury. All right, millimeters of mercury is just simply the unit used for pressure, even atmospheric pressure. The 120 and the 80, those numbers represent certain measures. The top number is known as the systolic blood pressure, and the bottom number is known as the diastolic blood pressure. The systolic blood pressure is the arterial pressure during ventricular contractions. So remember, going back to the heart, it has that two-pump system where you got the atria contracting and then the ventricles contracting. When the ventricles contract, blood from the left ventricle is sent to the entire body. Okay, so if you're feeling for your pulse, that pulse that you feel is the blood that's being pushed into the circulation whenever the left ventricle contracts. Okay, so between ventricular contractions, you don't feel the pulse, but there's still a pressure. That pressure is known as diastolic blood pressure. Okay, so the top number is the pressure that you feel at the moment that you feel the pulse, and then the diastolic pressure. I'm sorry if you see the circle moving in circles like crazy. I'm trying to see a cursor on my screen, and after a couple of seconds it hides, and I gotta kind of move it to reactivate it. So I'm sorry if you see circles just flying everywhere. All right, so the bottom number is the pressure inside the artery between pulses. Okay. So, now that we know normal blood pressure and what the numbers actually mean, hypertension is any consistent reading of 140 over 90 or higher. Okay, so there's times if you're exercising or if you're doing something that's active, your blood pressure can increase. What hypertension is referring to is chronic or consistent readings of over 140 over 90 at rest. So if you're sitting here in front of your computer watching these lectures, and then we take your blood pressure and your blood pressure is beyond this, then we'd be alarmed. Okay. Now it's important to understand what your blood pressure is, or to assess your blood pressure, because hypertension is known as a silent killer. If you have hypertension, it doesn't you don't necessarily feel it. You don't sense it. There's no way to really know that you have hypertension. The only way that you can know is if you get it checked. So if you're at a drugstore or a grocery store, if you go to the doctor on a regular basis, those are ways you can check your blood pressure for free, and it's relatively painless. I mean, there's slight discomfort whenever the cuff airs up and it increases pressure on your arm, but and I'm sure you can withstand that, and if you can withstand that, then you're able to get your blood pressure. Okay. All right. So this video is a demonstration of how they find how they assess blood pressure. Like the medical professionals. Nowadays we use the electronic versions. But back in the day, they used the sphygmomanometer, which is the blood pressure cuff and blood pressure gauge. So I've provided you with this video to see, so that you can see how blood pressure is measured if you've never done this before. So I'm going to press play, and you're going to see that this dial is going to increase in pressure, and that's why. And the reason why is because if you know what this whole apparatus looks like, that there's a blood pressure that goes around, a cuff that goes around the arm, and it's secured by Velcro. That there's a tube that comes out of that cuff that leads to a bulb that you can contract by just simply punching down on with your wrist, and every time you do that, it increases air. There's also a bell there's the other tube leads to this gauge. Okay. All right, so whenever you increase pressure, there's a little valve that you can turn to close, and that keeps the air inside the cuff. And then whenever you release the valve, it releases the air outside of the cuff. Okay, so if the valve is closed, meaning that the air is going to stay in the cuff, then the dial will increase. And you'll see in the video, at the very beginning of the video, the dial is increasing, and all that means is that the person who's assessing blood pressure is increasing the pressure inside the blood pressure cuff by pumping the bulb. Okay. So at the same time, the person assessing blood pressure has a stethoscope in their ears, and that's the device that you put in your ears, and it has a dial or a head, a bell that's located on the other end, and that's the device that they can check for heart rate. You know, they put it against your chest and they can hear your heart rate. Well, that's what they're doing with the with the stethoscope. You know, in measuring blood pressure, they put the head of the stethoscope inside the antecubital space, which is the front part of the elbow. And if you ever look at it, you can see that there's a vessel that goes right through that antecubital space. So that's where they put it, and they're listening for the pulse. All right, they're listening for blood to pass that particular area. Okay, so what they're listening for is a sound that sounds like a thump. Okay, it sounds like a thump. Okay, that's the best way I can describe it. So in this video, the dial is going to increase to about 175 millimeters of mercury, and then they're going to release the air, and then the valve is going to start going back down towards zero at about a rate of 5 millimeters of mercury per second. Okay, and then you're going to eventually hear a thud sound. It's going to go dum, 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 and it's eventually going to phase out. Okay. The first time you hear that thud or that thump, that is the systolic blood pressure. Okay. Now, whenever you hear the last thump before it fades into, you know, it goes back into silent mode, that is the diastolic pressure. So the range, the blood pressure range is simply the portion where you can actually hear the thump. Okay. So let me play this video so you can see what's going on. Okay, so hopefully, you know, you could see that it was the pressure increased all the way to 175 millimeters of mercury, but then whenever you heard the first sound was about 145, I believe, and then it ended about 80 or something. So you can look at it again, but you know, like again, the first time you hear the thud, that's the systolic blood pressure, and then the last time you hear the thud, that's the diastolic blood pressure. But you guys can do that again. All right. Let's see what else we have. Oh, okay. So the reason why it's so important to assess or to monitor your blood pressure is because of the effect it has on the kidneys. All right. So if you have chronic high blood pressure, you know, hypertension, there's a good chance that it's putting a lot of pressure on your arteries. Now, this is a picture representation of what the artery looks like. The arteries are located in your lower back on both sides. Okay. I'm sorry, the kidneys are. I don't know if I said the arteries or the kidneys. The kidneys are located on their backside, in your lower back on each side. Okay. Now, there's only one artery that goes into the kidney. Now, the purpose of the kidneys is to filter blood. What it does, it captures all the waste products, and you can see how blood goes into the artery. Into the kidney via the renal artery. So you have your left renal artery and your right renal artery that lead to the left and right kidney. Okay. The blood goes in, it's broken down into, you know, the capillaries, eventually the capillaries, and what happens is that all the waste in the blood is eventually filtered out and collected by a system of calyxes. All right, so here are all the calyxes. All right, and all of the waste goes into the calyxes and eventually leaves the kidney via the ureter. And the ureter eventually dumps into the bladder. Okay, all this waste is then urinated out. So that's that's one of the purposes of urination, is to eliminate waste from the blood. Okay, now what is waste? It's unneeded or unnecessary nutrients. Perhaps there's too much nutrients. You know, there's perhaps there's cells that have died, have been destroyed. So the blood delivers those destroyed or those destructed cells to the kidneys to be eliminated from the body. You know, any waste products of metabolism, anything could be a waste product. Okay, So then, it eventually exits out of the body through urine. Okay, so all of the good blood is then filtered back into circulation via the renal vein. Okay, whenever we look at blood pressure, there's only one artery that's going into the kidney. So all this kidney can be affected by high blood pressure, and that's what happens with people with chronic high blood pressure. Their kidneys start to suffer, and they become destroyed. It's called kidney failure. And if they can't filter their own blood, then they have to go through a process known as dialysis, where what they do is they insert a tube inside their arm, and they're able to retrieve all the blood from circulation, and all that blood goes to a dialysis machine, which is external to the body. So this, it usually takes about 3 to 5 hours. So someone who's undergoing dialysis has to sit there for 3 to 5 hours while blood leaves their body, goes to a machine, gets filtered out, and all that blood goes back into circulation. So that it could replace or substitute the function of the kidneys. So having kidney failure is a life-altering experience. It's very hard to work whenever you're missing 4 to 5 hours a day. Okay, so it's important to number one, engage in healthy behaviors, but then also monitor your health signs as well. Okay, so here are the health benefits of aerobic exercise that we discussed in Chapter 2. But there's just to reiterate that there's so many health benefits by engaging in healthy behaviors, exercise, managing stress, eliminating any negative behaviors like smoking or drug abuse or caffeine use, and improving your diet. And that's those are all things we're going to talk about. Okay, here's another picture from the book that talks about the same concepts. You can go through that. It's almost identical. Some more benefits. And then there's a lot of information at the end of the chapter. It's kind of repeated what we talked about in Chapter 2 when we talked about fitness. So you can go through those if you want to, but I'm not going to cover them in the video. Yeah, it seems like a lot, but a lot of it's repeated information. Okay.